All right. Well, hello everyone, and welcome back. It's been like 2 weeks, something like that. It has been a while. Nan is right. Uh, well, it's me, Jackson. I'm back, and joining me is my host and co-host Peter. As always, happy to have you.
Uh,
And we have the Dapper Dinosaur on today,
Hello.
and we also have a guest who goes by Alex. Welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Um, I had sent you I think it was the playlist that this video is going on, the 2024. Did you get a chance to see any of those?
I scrolled through it briefly, but
That's okay.
time gets
That's okay.
gets away from you.
Yeah, that's fine. It's like the point of sending those was just to show that like we don't yell and scream at our guests or or anything like that. So
Mhm.
that was
Unless
just
the guest yells and screams first.
but yeah, so I guess I want to ask, don't want to straw man you or anything, with regard to like the age of the earth and evolution, all that sort of stuff, where do you put yourself in all of that?
Well, I'm a Christian. I'm a Bible believing, professing Christian. I'm a pastor. I teach at a church in a small town in Iowa. Ultimately, my worldview flows from that which is revealed in the scriptures. So I believe that apart from Christ, you can't have a foundation for really knowing anything. That's not to say we can't know anything, but we can't give a foundation for why we know it. In Christ, we find in Christ is hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Apart from fear of the Lord, we cannot have true wisdom. So, therefore, when I look at anything, I do so through a Christian worldview according to what God has revealed in His Word. So, that is my approach ultimately to anything. I approach it from a Christian worldview. I believe that's the only consistent way to be able to understand anything: science, empiricism, morality, uh, anything ultimately. So, when it comes to the age of the world and things like that, I believe in the biblical narrative that we did not develop over a period of time. Rather, we were spontaneously created by an all knowing and all powerful God. He did so. Through 6 days, we see the day night cycle there. I believe that Genesis does teach history. I believe that the reason that human beings face the things that they do, sin and death, is ultimately, or death and disease, is ultimately because of their rebellion against God. And I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He was truly born of a virgin, truly died on the cross, truly rose again from the dead, and only through faith in Him and only through trusting in Him can we really have a foundation for any kind of knowledge. So that's kind of a long way of answering your question. Yeah, I believe in the Genesis narrative. I believe that there's nothing in the natural world that is contrary to what we find in Genesis. So yeah, that would put the age of the Earth somewhere around 6,000 years. I didn't really do the math. I'm not the numeratician.
Sure, 6 to 10,000 years old, somewhere in there.
Sure,
Right.
somewhere in there.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I don't spend my days defending young Earth creationism or anything. I teach the Bible, therefore I teach all of it. So it's not my shtick, but it's something I'm certainly willing to talk about. Evolution, I do not believe is scientific. I believe evolution is ultimately a worldview. It is a frame through which all things are viewed. It is a frame through which evidence is interpreted. I do not believe that evolution is proven the way that other things are proven scientifically via the scientific method. So, and that goes to the original where we originally met, right?
Okay.
We talked on Twitter, and you can fill in from there if you want.
Actually,
Okay.
a quick question, if I may.
Sure.
So, Alex, if you were to Now, you might not be interested in doing so, but let's say, for the sake of argument, you were interested in trying to do the math to figure out how old you thought the Bible said that the Earth was. Would you prefer the dates given in the genealogy in Genesis from the Masoretic text or the Septuagint?
Probably the Masoretic, though I can recognize places, especially with the age of Saul, for instance, where the Septuagint perhaps offers a corrective of that. But
Okay.
Again, that's not one of the things I'm not going to delve too deeply into or really worry about.
That seems fair. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
I do want to point out, and I did say this during DMs, that Dapper and I are not here to defend atheism, so
Sure.
we are perfectly willing to, if our guest is like, well, I think science can't exist without Christianity, then I'll say, well, okay, well, for the sake of argument, Dapper and I are theists, and not just any theists, we'll be Christian theists, and we'll affirm Jesus is the Son of God, etc. And
Okay,
hey, I'm still looking forward to Easter this year because I'm going to make lamb tacos.
So the reason we do that. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was going to say, okay, so you're granting the Christian worldview.
Sure. Yeah. The reason we do that
then you grant what Jesus taught about the Old Testament and the historicity of it.
So I will also point out very quickly that lots of Christians don't do that, right? So there are lots of Christians like Kenneth Miller and Mary Schweitzer, Robert Bacher, some of whom of those people, actually, Robert Bacher was a Pentecostal preacher. So like clearly that's not the only. It's not just you're either an atheist, materialist, evolutionist, blah blah blah, or you're a young Earth creationist and all the rest.
Sure.
Obviously, there are shades of gray here, and we don't want to misconstrue that. And so that's why I say. So, for instance, like when we have guests on, because we're not here to push atheism. I don't care whether someone's a Christian or an atheist. Not my business. This isn't a channel for that.
Or other things. Those aren't the only options.
Right, or Hindu or Muslim or whatever. I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. My only interest is what does the science say? And if our guest is like, well, you have to have a foundation in Christianity to reason about the science, I say, okay, well, fine. We're all Christians here. Let's talk about the science. So I think that kind of skips past a lot of those other philosophical issues. So I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, because I could be wrong. I've slept since we first talked. I believe this started when I commented on that Tucker Carlson Joe Rogan video in which Tucker Carlson is like saying, well, evolution's not true because it's just a theory, which I was like, yikes, I didn't think that was a talking point anymore, because I'm pretty sure AIG and ICR say not to use that talking point anymore. At least ICR does. So I was a little shocked, and then I don't remember what we specifically talked about early on, but as I was saying during or before we came on, I don't have as much time as I used to argue with people on Twitter, so now I'm just kind of at the point where I say, listen, if you want to talk, I'm happy to have you on. We can hash it out on the channel. That's just kind of how I'm filtering conversations nowadays. So we chatted for a little bit in DMs before doing this, and that's all right so far. I haven't misconstrued anything, I hope.
No.
Okay. And you kind of mentioned this also in your introduction that you just gave, which is that like this isn't so much. You mentioned that this isn't really so much about the evidence. This is more about the interpretation of the evidence. Would you say that's accurate? I don't want to straw man you.
Yeah. Well, what I would say is evidence is always going to be interpreted through the lens of worldview, right? And I would argue that evolution is a worldview through which that evidence is interpreted. And therefore, because the worldview demands millions of years or whatever else it is, because the worldview demands naturalistic means for the development of the complexity of life, therefore, that's going to be the conclusion, right? Because the worldview is already there. So explain to me, if you would, I understand you're teaching a few things. Explain to me the scientific method and how that works.
So generally, when you first it kind of depends. Typically, we say like, oh, you ask a question, then you form a hypothesis based on that question. But well, it's not technically true because you do a literature review first, usually before you ask a question, so you can figure out what questions there are to ask. But either way,
See
you
if the
typically start.
question's already been asked and answered.
Right, exactly. And so you typically start with the literature review, and then you say, okay, well, these are open areas of research. These are the cutting edge, and then from those, you pick one or more questions, and then you can look at the available evidence that there is for that question, assuming there is any. Or science nowadays isn't typically just going fishing. There's usually some literature to look at first before forming a hypothesis. But you can form your hypothesis, and then you start gathering data, either by doing field work or by performing an experiment, or maybe you already have all these points of data. So like if you're doing medical, like the big data sort of medical studies, for instance, where all the experiments have already been formed, but or that's not the right word, all the data already exists out there. You just need to pull it
Interpret
all
the
in.
data. Yeah.
Right, you need to interpret it and see what how many people taking this medicine got better afterwards, how many people got more sick or what have you, or didn't affect them at all. Either way, you're interpreting some set of data, and then from that you are and you interpret that data through your results. You do a variety of statistical methods. There are different tests that you can run that will tell you whether or not there's a statistically significant correlation between your data sets, between your dependent, independent variables or what have you, or between data sets. And then from there, you can draw your conclusions, and you hope generate further questions, which you can then get grants for from your university. So
Sure. Yeah, that's the longer answer, more on a university level, right? But
Yeah.
the scientific method, you basically begin with your hypothesis, or you begin with the question, right?
sure.
Research, hypothesis, you test, and then you change your hypothesis depending on the results
Right.
of that test.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
but science is empirical. Science acknowledges the uniformity of nature, right? If I so so these are things that can be tested, right? If I make a scientific claim, I can then go demonstrate that claim empirically, right?
Well,
Sure.
the more important thing ultimately is that you can you fail to demonstrate contrary claims ultimately, because no amount of positive evidence is ever going to conclusively show that you're right. However, if you can,
Sure.
there are ways to conclusively show that alternate ideas are wrong. And so science is more often a process of elimination of all the wrong options than it is the just direct, we confirm the correct option. Because the thing is, confirmation is trivially easy. The very fact that you think that your hypothesis is reasonable probably already says that there's confirmation that you see out there in the world.
Of course. Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's more important to show that
Confirmation
you're
bias. Yeah.
right. So it's more important to say which things are wrong than to try and pretend that you have a certainty about what's right. However, when something has been, like, we'll take relativity, right? Every prediction of relativity that we've been able to test has been confirmed with high degrees of accuracy. We have gravitational waves. We've seen Einstein rings, Einstein crosses, the distortion of the position of stars during solar eclipses. We have, like changes in the rate of time between satellites and Earth that has to be accounted for your GPS to work. And so because every single prediction has been confirmed, and every single option for another possibility for how the universe works at high speeds and at large scales has been found to be wanting, we can reasonably say, okay, so general relativity is true, even if that has a little asterisk after it saying we can never reach 100% certainty, and all of this is provisional, and assuming that all of our predictions continue to prove correct. Like, okay, sure. And so, yeah, that is one thing, because yeah, it is true that science doesn't really reach 100% certainty.
Sure.
But when you're at like 99.89s in a row, yeah, you can call it good.
Sure. Yeah. And the reason I ask is not because I'm ignorant of it, obviously. You guys know more than I do. This is how you spend your days. But, I've taken the high school science classes. I've taken the prerequisites for college, the gen eds to graduate with a bachelor's, all that fun stuff. So it's not my field, but I'm not walking into it just completely clueless, because that's often how people with my worldview are presented. is they're completely clueless on the science, on scientific method, on these various things, and they trade reason for faith in a sense where it's like I'm saying I don't care, and this is an overgeneralization obviously, right? I'm not saying you say this, but this is often how it can be presented, where it's presented as if I don't care about the evidence because I've got faith in what it says, where my argument is no, we can all look at the evidence, but how one interprets the evidence is going to be dependent on the worldview. We all approach evidence with a certain set of lenses, don't we? Right?
I was gonna say, like, I typically, or Dapper and I typically, we don't usually talk to people who just like don't know anything about science and are
Sure.
just like,
Yeah.
I don't buy evolution because of faith, and I don't think we've ever represented people like that. Typically, the people we talk with, um, I suppose I
They
could say they're
believe they
not.
have an evidential reason
Yes,
for their scientific conclusions.
yes,
Okay.
they do believe they have a series of arguments or pieces of evidence that support them. We don't typically, or at least, we don't typically. We give
Yeah,
people the
look,
benefit of the doubt. We let them,
if your position is just I reject this idea from science because I have faith and that's it, then I'm just gonna okay, cool. There's not really much room for a discussion at that point.
Sure.
Like have fun with it. I'm not gonna sit here and just try to argue with someone who isn't interested in looking at evidence about evidence, and ultimately I don't really care to have a presuppositional discussion either. So if that's someone's position, then I'm just gonna leave them alone.
Well, but hold on. We all have presuppositions, don't we?
Sure.
So you have presuppositions. How do you know whether or not those presuppositions are valid?
So I try to take the tack that my presuppositions are the minimal ones required to actually go ahead and act in a well-reasoned way in the world. So, for instance, I believe that broadly speaking, my senses give me a mostly trustworthy within their limits view of the external existence. So, for instance, when I touch something hot, I think that there's probably, reasonably accurate assessment of that thing that it's hot, or at least it is transferring thermal energy to me. I also believe that there is an external reality out there that is not dependent on me. And I also, which is one of the big parts of science, believe that the physical operations that the universe works on are largely invariant across time and space. So, for instance, if I don't know, I eat a strawberry and then I eat another strawberry 3 days later, I don't expect the strawberry to suddenly taste like what I remember a grape tasting like, because that would be some kind of weird change in very basic ways that the universe seems to work, like how the chemistry of my taste receptors work. So yeah, those are the basic ones. And like we said, I'm perfectly willing to grant that all of this is grounded in the triune nature of God, and that the universe was created in at least some way by the action of the Trinity through the direct, causation of the second person, and that's fine by me for at least this discussion.
But I would then go on to say, but you would not concede that it happened in the way that God has revealed it happened.
So that's where the science comes in, right?
Sure.
Because if we can take that basis of like, okay, well, God is our foundation for reasoning, and then we can use our reasoning to look at the world and derive facts, from that, then there seems to be a conflict here, right? And that's kind of what I was getting at with our DMs, which was that first of all, I don't even really agree with the premise that we all have the same evidence, and typically, because Dapper and I have heard that a lot. We've had this discussion with a lot of people.
So do non-believers have a secret cache of evidence that they
Actually,
don't
yes.
let
Typically, yes.
It's I wouldn't say it's secret. What I
It's
would
not
actually
secret.
say is what I find is that generally speaking, most anti-evolutionists ignore somewhere around 90% of the available data.
Well, let me ask this. Are we ignoring the empirical evidence, or are we ignoring the interpretation of that evidence?
It's
No,
kind
the
of
actual,
both.
yeah, well, there is both, right? So I will even see creationists ignoring their own data. So, for instance, I was looking at a creationist who was talking about paleocurrent data seeming to indicate to him that there was this anomalous amount of concordant paleocurrent data with some kind of directional bias throughout the fossil record. And then you just run his numbers, and it's just not true. His own numbers that he reported in his own literature does not support the conclusion he's drawing from it by just the math. Like when he says that, like, oh, there's like 80% of paleocurrents at this time are going west to east, and you look, and it's just not true. It's like a bit over 30% or something. I don't remember the exact numbers, but like you just run his own numbers, and it's just not true. Now, I don't know if he's doing that intentionally or what. It's just an anecdote, but that is what I mean when I say that you're just ignoring the data. Is you are not
looking at it with a bias, and that could be preventing him from seeing that, right?
Yeah, I mean that could be. But what I also find is that when scientists are working on this and they leave out significant amounts of data, what tends to happen is they have a correction that they have to issue, and then they issue it. And it's true that maybe they come to the same conclusion, or more often what they just do is they actually do a good literature search and they don't ignore most of that data. And so they don't usually have to have that problem. And further, there are whole topics that creationists, as far as I can tell, just largely don't actually discuss at all.
Which,
like biogeography is one of the biggest ones.
Yes, biogeography and biostratigraphy. Those were the two that I mentioned in our DM conversations. I didn't really go into biogeography too much, but I did mention a bit of the biostratigraphy. Those fields, like, are and again, RJ's in the live chat, we wrote we co-authored together a book and work on a second one. And we have looked at a lot of papers by Young Earth Creationists, either from AIG or ICR, or, well, it's not a Young Earth Creationist site like the Discovery Institute, that's Intelligent Design, but we've looked at a lot of the literature that they've put out, and it largely just ignores these topics. And a large part of the reason is I don't think there's any way, and I'm pretty sure Dapper would agree with me, to just sort of crunch these into 10,000 years. Right. So index fossils are my go-to example because I've read a non-trivial amount of research on index fossils, and the typical responses from creationists don't work unless creationists come up with a new way that water works, which is also what I was getting at in our DMs. And here's what I mean. So the typical so index fossils, first of all, for anyone who's not aware, index fossils are when you have a particular species that is very wide in its horizontal distribution. So they're in every ocean, or almost every ocean, at for a particular time, or on like every continent for a particular time. But it's very short vertically, so the actual amount of time that they are all over the place is very short, and they don't overlap with the things either above or below them. And we basically have generated the geological column off of index fossils, at least for like the Paleozoic. Up to the Paleozoic. So the Phanerozoic, the last like 540 million years of geologic history, each of the different epochs are based on an index fossil. So you have this particular species of ammonite that goes for this time period, and then you have another particular species of ammonite for the next time period, then another one, and so on. Well, at least until the end Cretaceous when all the ammonites got wiped out.
Rip.
And so the responses by creationists are typically twofold. We had a guy on a few weeks ago who tried to go with, we had to explain like both of these really don't work. So the first explanation is hydrological sorting, which is essentially that based on the density or the and whatnot, and the size and the weight and the drag of the animal or plant or whatever, they should settle out at a particular region in the geological column. We just don't see that. Things like foraminifera, radiolarians, diatoms, these guys are all throughout the column up to like Jurassic, I think, or Triassic, something like that.
And they're importantly not in order of any kind of hydrologic properties, right? There's no density gradient that you can follow up, or like a gradient of more hydrodynamically, smooth shapes going up or down. Like none of it correlates.
It varies all over
any
the place.
hydrological process.
Yeah. So
which
the first
means
one
can't be that.
Right. So the first explanation, because we know how water works, so that can't explain their distribution. So the second explanation that creationists like to go to is environmental sorting, So either in the ocean, they'll say like, okay, well, the things in the deep ocean were buried first, and then things are, as they go up, as you go up in the geological column, they are either up like, higher on land, more towards the mountains, or in the ocean, they're in higher levels of the ocean,
Jackson,
like they're
I
closer
don't
to the
see what
surface.
you have. What's wrong with you that you don't accept the idea of deep sea phytoplankton?
Well, I think that word "phyto" or that prefix "phyto" might be the central issue. However, there are deep sea foraminifera like xenophyophores, but they don't do the whole phyto thing,
Hmm.
So, um, anyway, um, or sorry, the not the phyto, anyway,
They don't do
so
the photosynthesis.
the photosynthesis part, yeah. So they don't do the photosynthesis part. So so that so okay, so the first explanation doesn't work. The second explanation, there, it's by environment. We also don't see that phytoplankton uh, typically live in the photic zone, which is the zone where light penetrates into the water column, because they do photosynthesis. They make their sugars like glucose, and so they have to stay in a particular region of the water column to do that. And so you can find them, and again, you can match the stratum with where it is deposited, right? So there are different chemical markers for looking at whether a stratum is deposited in the deep ocean versus the near the surface. And so environmental sorting doesn't really work for this either. It's not that the ones that are way down in the Triassic were deep sea, and then like they're progressively more towards the photic zone as you go up. Like that doesn't really explain it either. So these are the two primary modes that creationists try to use, and they don't work.
Okay, so because those don't work, or at least your reading of it, they don't work. And again, I'm not a paleontologist. I don't know, right? So why is the default that, well, because it couldn't have been either of them, it must have been a dispersion of millions and billions of years?
So the
And
reason for
that's why I say
sorry.
it's a worldview, because it ultimately defaults back to that. We can explain away these other explanations for it, and the default is always millions and billions of years.
Well, so that is the explanation that has been posed based on a series of lines of independent modes of data that gives the best explanation for this. The explanation that we can, continually we can make predictions on. So, for instance, if I want to, I don't know, if I'm looking at like Pachydiscus nuberticus, if I'm looking at like this particular species of ammonite, and I go to a stratum where, like, okay, well, we've looked, or we've dug, and okay, we found this particular species. Well, I can predict that the ammonite in the layer directly below it is going to be this other species. And then you can
Sure.
do that, and you can dig and find, oh, hey, look, it's that species I mentioned, or that I predicted. Like that happens all the time, because that's how we search for like oil, stuff like that. You have to know the age of your layers so that you can do oil exploration. Um, so
So the explanation then is they lived at a certain period of time rather than being all buried over a short period of time all at the same time, which could
Yeah.
be a plausible explanation,
Well,
right?
so
And if we have a history recording such an event, then I can point to that history and say, well, this can explain it. Why is it that we have all these creatures on the exact same layer? Because there was a worldwide flood or whatever that would have buried that kind of creature at the exact same point in time.
so let me give this a go. The data that we have from fossils and just from the actual sediments absolutely precludes a worldwide flood for a few reasons. One of which is that the fossils simply are not arranged in a way that can be explained by a flood. And second, most of the strata that we see are kinds of strata that cannot be laid down by a flood in the first place. Now, if you want to say that they were, that's great, and I would encourage creationists, not just you in particular, Alex, I mean just as a group, right? That perhaps instead of spending millions of dollars on a wooden building that's kind of shaped like a boat, except in the back, that instead you get a hydrology tank, and you can have sedimentation experiments and things like that, where you produce fine-grained non-flocculated shale in a turbulent high-energy environment, or
Well,
you can deposit limestone that way. But failing that, since that hasn't happened yet,
mhm.
what we have is we have known mechanisms that can produce the kinds of rocks that we see, and in many cases, they are things like low energy systems where you have to deposit things slowly or you don't get the kind of rock we're seeing. And then on top of that, while we can't go from just directly stratigraphy to the actual age of the Earth, right? We have to have other things like radiometric dating. But if we're just sticking to just stratigraphy, including biostratigraphy, we can get a minimum age for the Earth. And it's going to be on the order of at least a few million, or at the very shortest, many 100,000 of years. In fact, very soon after Darwin, many geologists objected to his idea on the basis that they didn't think the Earth was old enough. And one of the reasons for that was they thought that if the Earth had started molten, then it wasn't cool enough yet for it to be as old as Darwin needed it to be. And so for quite a while, there was a whole big thing about whether or not evolution was compatible with geology, specifically because geology said the Earth was too young. So it's also not the case that geologists are in some kind of even unconscious conspiracy to promote evolution, because at least at first, they were just like, nah, not buying it. That doesn't seem possible.
Well, you said something interesting. You said there's no way to test it, and you said, maybe we can build some tanks and things like that. But
that is a way to test it.
It's that would be a way to test it, but it's impossible to test something taking place on a global scale in just a local way. And that's why I use the analogy of, okay, how can I test the effect of a worldwide fire? If all the trees in the world were to spontaneously combust, what would be the effect on human life? Well, I'm going to test that in a local way by burning the tree in my backyard. I burned the tree in my backyard. I did all kinds of tests, and it seemed to have no effect on the life in my neighborhood. So I can't test a worldwide event, but in the same way, we can't test empirically, where we set it up in a controlled way, what would happen over millions and millions of years.
So I take issue with that, with the fire example, because like if you want to compare, for instance, like a match burning, for instance, to a bonfire, or your tree burning, whatever. So the same thing is happening with that match on a much smaller scale, right? So when you light a match, you are producing heat, you're producing light, you are burning off, aromatic polycyclic hydrocarbons, things like that. Likewise, you're just doing it, very, very small. But when you're, setting a bonfire ablaze, you are also producing heat and light, and also burning off lots of particulates like polycyclic hydrocarbons. The same exact process is going on in both of those examples. The same process. But what we would have to propose for a global flood is not that. We would have to propose that a new set of physics describes actually when you have a lot of water compared to when you have a little bit of water. And that there's no evidence for that. Like, that's what I was saying. So, or with our like in our DMs, that's what I was saying. I was baffled that like you could take an example like with the match versus the bonfire and say, okay, these are the same at different scales because the same physics are governing both of these, versus like somehow water figures out the ability to organize organisms by species. Well, that's not how water works.
But at this, again, going back to that second theory that's laid out, it couldn't be plausible that the species were already organized, and that's just simply the order in which they were buried based on how the water moved.
There's no evidence.
And again,
they
we
were
can't test
before.
The problem. What?
We can't. There's no evidence they were like. What do you mean? Like, do you mean they were organized that way in the water column, and then the flood just simply buried them that way?
No, I mean, we see species organized today, right? I know fish don't live up in the sky. I know fish live in the ocean.
Right. So environmental sorting is what you're going for.
Environmental sorting. So
okay, but we already ruled that out.
That already doesn't work. We already have deep sea organisms at high strata. We already have land creatures at low strata. We even have land deposits that don't have life, but from like the pre-Cambrian period. Like if you want to see, like a fluvial deposit, which is like a river deposit, or even just like Aeolian deposits, which are windborne deposits from before life on land, you can find those things. Those things exist. There's not a huge number of them because, the
they've
rock
mostly
cycle.
mostly been
But like there's prebiotic sedimentary rocks from various environments.
That's assuming the waters would affect the environment and the creatures in the same way everywhere. Where
no, it's not assuming that at all. It's just assuming that the physics of water didn't miraculously change. Now, if you want to posit
I'm not saying the physics change, but we all know that floods bury things, right?
But floods don't bury things in a very finely stratified sequence.
Right.
Floods don't do
that. And they only deposit certain kinds of rocks. They deposit specifically various turbidites. You get things like graded bedding. You'll get like a turbidite mudstone or something, right? But that is not what characterizes the majority of the rocks around the world, right? If you come to a subaerial tuff, which is distinguishable because they form right now, right? There's some subaerial tuff forming around Mount St. Helens this minute, right now.
He means a volcanic eruption on land, right?
Yeah, so where a volcanic ash comes down through the air and settles on the land, and now it's going to turn into a volcanic rock as that ash compresses. We can find that all over the place, right? All through the geological column, we can find things like subaerial tuff, which can't form in a flood, can't even form underwater, right? Or we get wind-blown sand dunes preserved. You can't have wind-blown sand dunes underwater. And in fact, we can tell the difference between aquatic sand dunes and wind-borne sand dunes because they have different characteristic slope angles because of the different densities and viscosities of things like air and water. So we can test these things, right? We can say, okay, we don't currently have a physical explanation for how this particular rock could form underwater. Therefore, until someone comes up with one, our only conclusion has to be that it didn't. And the problem is that we find those kinds of rocks all over the place. And even for the ones that did form in water, in many cases, we know things like the maximum that we can get them to form under known physical conditions, like the maximum rate, and what rate or what conditions are most conducive to that maximum rate. For instance, like a biogenic limestone.
Mm-hmm.
It can grow like a couple centimeters per millennium at its most in terms of overall depth. Now you can have like a slump in the sediment where you can have a local rapid increase in sediment depth at the expense of a rapid decrease uphill. But still, on net for the entire bed to grow, it takes at maximum, the maximum speed is about a couple centimeters per millennium. And we have formations of this stuff that are hundreds of feet tall. You can go to the Grand Canyon and just look at it. And you can just do the math. What's the minimum amount of time that would take to form this? And it comes out to be like hundreds of thousands of years. And so to propose that a flood did this in the space of a bit over a year, which is when you add up all the days.
Hold on. But that's assuming the rocks formed in the flood, and we're not just simply already formed, right?
Yeah,
It's an assumption based on what? That it
so
did not form in the flood. We can prove that it didn't form in the flood, but it doesn't mean that it moved by.
Yeah, so
this gets to the overall point, right? A lot of this stuff is over my head. I'm sure we could throw scientists back and forth, but this is simply a demonstration of what I'm showing. I can look at it, and creationist scientists can look at certain things based off of a certain worldview. I will look at evidence based on what I know from what God has spoken in his word. I know God does not lie. Therefore, what God has said in his word is going to be consistent with what I find in nature. I may not be able to explain things right away, ultimately, but it doesn't mean that it's unexplainable. We all approach it from a different worldview. So, and again, these are things that can't necessarily be tested empirically. I can't test a worldwide flood any more than you can test millions and millions and millions of years. I can't set up a lab experiment that will flood the world in the way described, in a supernatural way described in the book of Genesis, in the same way you can't set up a lab experiment that will judge millions and millions of years.
Okay, so
let me try something with the tree idea that you had, right? Where you're not sure what would happen if you had all trees on Earth simultaneously or roughly simultaneously burned down, right?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say that one of the things it would do, and I don't know all the things it would do, but one thing I know it would do is it would mean that all of the land on Earth that had extensive vegetation cover, so we're excluding things like, the Sahara or something, would have a whole bunch of charcoal on it.
Yep.
Okay. And so if the question then is, has there been a previous in history worldwide forest fire event?
I don't know.
And I say, I don't know, but I can tell that it hasn't happened in any of the rocks that I have available because none of them have a big charcoal deposit that is relatively thin because it happened all at once instead of subsequent fires over a long time, and that is covering a wide geographic distribution. So one of the things we can say about the forest fire is that while we don't know all the results, we know for certain at least some of them. And similarly for a flood, well, I will grant you that we might not know all of the results of a worldwide flood. We do know some of them. And one of them would be a worldwide in distribution flood layer. Now, it would not have to be completely worldwide in the sense that it would have to be in every single literal location, because there has been things like erosion and whatnot that could have removed it. That's fair. But there is not any widely distributed flood deposit that we can correlate to a single point in time, no matter how big or small a time the geologic column represents. And we can point to and say, this is a flood deposit and it's all over the place. And it is at least plausibly a worldwide flood result. And if you want to say that certain things that couldn't have been formed by a flood are just things that happened temporally outside the period of Noah's flood, you're going to have some problems, because you're not going to have a place to put the flood that's going to allow you to maintain a 6,000-year-old Earth if the flood layers, sorry, I have a little frog in my throat, I think, if the flood layers are not vertically extensive, right? There's a reason that most young Earth creationist organizations put all of the rocks between the start of the Cambrian and either the end of the Cretaceous, or even in some cases, more like the end of the Miocene, as all deposited by the flood, even though we know that's physically impossible for the vast majority of those rocks to have been deposited by a flood. The reason for that is because otherwise they would have to account for all of this extra geology that they also don't have time for. So actually one of the reasons that Institute for Creation Research has such a late proposed flood boundary is because they know that there's so much quote unquote recent geology that they would have to account for. They don't want to account for all of the Paleogene and Miocene and Eocene rocks, right? Because there's hundreds of feet of them all over the place that they would have to account for with non-flood mechanisms. And with the flood, what they do is they just kind of hide the ball with that. I'm like, well, the flood can do lots of things. And then, honestly, when it comes to actual geologists from young Earth creationists that I've looked into and actually looked into their claims in detail, usually I come to the conclusion that they are actually just lying, because I know that they're doing things that are inappropriate. Like when Andrew Snelling decided to take a picture of a rock fold and say that it didn't have stress fractures in it. And the reason that his picture didn't show stress fractures is because he had people. No, he was zoomed in fine. He specifically had people placed in front of the stress fractures, which are clearly visible in other pictures of the same formation. So you can't tell me he's lying about that.
Yeah, and I would say stuff like that is dishonest, right? I think it is intellectually dishonest when we come across something that we can't explain right now to just come up with an explanation. So it doesn't mean there isn't an explanation. It doesn't mean that there isn't an explanation consistent with my worldview, but it doesn't mean I should just make something up, right? And
well, no one's asking you to.
What?
No one's asking you to just make something
I know, but I say that because it's the same with the evolutionary worldview, because there are things that I might not necessarily be able to account for right now, right? Especially me not being a scientist, or maybe young Earth creationists, maybe they can't account for it right now. It doesn't mean that they're not accountable, right?
Well, could you give an example of something you think where scientists have given an explanation at odds with creationism, and you believe that they do not, that explanation is not warranted by the data?
Well, the origin of life, for instance. And you guys aren't willing to go there because you
we're not chemists.
Yeah, you're not chemists. But again,
in fairness, I don't think anyone here really has the...
Yeah, I'm not aware of an explanation for the origin of life that's even really been put forth as a answer to the question of where life came from. I'm aware of...
Well, I'm aware of one
for parts of it.
I'm aware of one that's been around since the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth. He created all life within it. So
okay, but without moving that goalpost to being anyone putting forth any hypothesis, I'm not aware of a scientific hypothesis for the origin of life that has been proposed as the explanation for how life arose first on Earth. Now, I'll agree that there are various hypotheses about how certain parts of life could arise abiotically, but I don't think we're anywhere close to having a unifying theory of all of these ideas that would explain from scratch getting to life. I don't think anyone's there yet. I don't think anyone's claiming to be there yet as far as a scientific explanation goes.
And that's where I would say that's where the evolutionist relies on the Christian worldview, the fact that life exists. You can't give an account for it from your worldview, right? The Christian worldview gives an answer. God created life.
That's not really the question I asked, though. Is there a place where you can find an actual conclusion that scientists have put forth in the field of evolution, or geology, say, that you think is unwarranted by the actual data available? because I can give you a whole bunch of those for creationism, right? Like that virtually any given rock formation could have been caused by a worldwide flood, because that is a strong conclusion that young Earth creationists have come to. Or I could say that, say, humans don't share any common ancestry with non-human animals. That's another strong conclusion that young Earth creationists have come to. I don't think the data warrants it. You said that that was true of scientists broadly in evolutionary biology. And I disagree that there is a conclusion about the origin of life other than that it seems to have happened at some point, because there was no life once and now there is.
Okay, but that can't be explained scientifically, can it?
Well,
And
no
yet-
one's really claiming otherwise, at least not currently that I'm aware of.
So it's something
there a
it's something that is to be accepted on faith, right?
No, because there's not something being accepted.
But it is being accepted that life somehow came into being.
Well, that's just a logical necessity, right?
Okay.
Everyone accepts that. You accept that. We accept that. Anyone who can
Except I have a foundation for accepting it. Right?
We already agreed that
Great.
Christianity is true. So,
But can you?
But then
I'm
we
just
get
asking you to
we
make
get back
good
we
on
get
your
back-
accusation, basically, because you said a thing, and I don't know that it's true, and I'm not sure that you can come up with an example of it where science has made a conclusion, and you think that the data doesn't warrant it. Instead, what you gave me is a place where science has not made a conclusion. Which, okay,
I gave you a place
granted,
where there is no scientific explanation for it, right?
right, nor is one claimed. So
Right.
what is a place where there is a claimed scientific explanation?
Well, there have been
you
all
think
kinds
the
of
data
there
doesn't
have been all kinds of claims. made.
so when researchers who are origin of life researchers, what they are doing is looking at like individual particular mechanisms for like particular chemical reactions, right? So it's people looking at things like how do how do two nucleotides bond together like prebiotically? But nobody, what Deborah's saying is no researchers, no origin of life researchers anywhere are saying, hey, we have a singular mechanism that explains everything from just a bunch of inorganic molecules inorganic molecules bopping around to a protocell. No one has that. No one's proclaimed that. That's not a thing that exists.
We can move beyond that then. How about then I'll say that the diversity that we see in life forms is a result of evolution.
Okay, so that's something we can actually dig into. So do you know what the mechanisms of evolution are?
Explain it to me, because I get the feeling, I obviously learned evolution in both high school and college. But I get the feeling as soon as I explain it, you're going to say, oh, no, that's not what we believe at all. And then say something that's pretty much what I just said with a few adjustments. So go ahead and explain in broad strokes your theory of evolution.
I mean, I don't think you have really any warrant to assume that, because that hasn't happened so far in this discussion.
But I know it hasn't happened, but I've seen comments of you saying, oh, this person's just appealing to Darwin. Doesn't he know that?
Yeah, well, when people say, so when I say like, okay, I don't want people saying Darwinism. I hate that word. And the reason is I'm very careful about the way that I use like historical terms, because Darwinism is a historical term. Darwinism refers to a particular time in evolutionary theory from when Darwin published Origin of Species to a group of people who existed like into the like 1920s, basically. So that time period. Right, the micromutationists, right. So basically the time period from like the 1860s to the 1920s, you had a group of people who were termed the Darwinists. Now you have like neo-Darwinists. There's two different kinds of neo-Darwinists. There were the ones of the late 1800s who were separate from the neo-Darwinists of the 1930s. And then you had the like macromutationists. Essentially, regardless, aside. Essentially, the point with that was that is a particular historical term, and I don't like people calling the modern version of evolutionary theory Darwinism, because it isn't, right? We have like
that's fine.
It's like it's a bit like saying it's like calling physics Newtonian physics. It's like what?
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
Or it also might be like calling Christianity like Genesisism. It's like there's a whole lot more besides Genesis that I feel like you think is important to Christianity.
Sure.
So if I called you a Genesis,
the Genesis then would be the foundation of.
Sure, and you can say Darwin is the foundation of evolutionary theory, and that's true.
So basically, in broad strokes, then let's say, whether it's an accurate way of putting it or not, I learned Darwinian evolution, right?
Well,
so what I learned in the high school level and in the college level.
Well, I actually doubt that, because I would guess you learned about mutations, which means it's not Darwinian evolution.
Right. So okay. So just
Okay,
broadly,
yeah. I learned about mutations. Yep.
Then
the
it's not
broad
Darwinian.
right, because Darwin didn't know about
Sure, yeah.
mutations. He didn't know what genetics was, any of that. Okay. So
And
broadly,
again, that's why regardless of whether it's an accurate name or not. So the evolution I learned in college, am I completely wrong? Have I completely missed the boat on that? So when I
I have
address,
I have no idea. So so broadly, evolutionary theory encompasses a few different mechanisms, right? So you start with the generation of genetic variation, either through mutations or recombination or horizontal gene transfer or endogenous retroviruses, well, which I guess would
That's still
kind of fall
horizontal gene
under
transfer.
it would fall under horizontal gene transfer anyways. So basically, you have a few different mechanisms by which diversity is generated within a population, right? So it can either be mutations are kind of the big one. That's what people love to talk about. And then you can have different types of mutations. So mutations have different fitness effects on individuals. So a mutation could, if it's really bad, causes like phenylketonuria or something like that, and you don't survive childhood, that's generally considered bad. Um, some mutations are neutral, so they have or are neutral, so they have effectively no effect. The selective effect is so small it is essentially negligible. So those
Or
are
in some
neutral,
cases, just is actually exactly zero.
right? So yeah, it's yeah, and so those are the predominance of mutations. Most mutations tend to fall in either they are selectively neutral or they are deleterious. And then there are also the beneficial mutation, or which have a positive fitness effect on their carriers, and then those are the ones that, under natural and sexual selection, tend to increase in your population because they provide a benefit to the carriers as opposed to the non-carriers. So you have your mechanisms. So then you have recombination, which effectively shuffles your uh, genes, and then you have horizontal gene transfer. So you can get different sets of alleles. So not everyone has like, it's not like you get them from your parents and then just you send off the exact same sets to your offspring. You can have shuffling between your alleles, so that, like, maybe one chromosome is like now, instead of 100% paternal, it's like 75% paternal and 25% maternal, something like that, right? And then you have horizontal gene transfer, where you can trade genetic material between individuals. So that's or without descent. So that's things like viruses inputting their genes into you, or bacteria sharing genes among each other. That's how we get stuff like like antibiotic resistance spreading so fast, because like plasmids and things like that are shared between bacteria. So you have your creation of variation, then you have your selection mechanisms. So things like you have natural selection. That's one of the big ones. So harmful mutations are give the individual they impact the individual negatively, so they are likely to be selected against. Neutral
But I think we
variation,
should point out it's specifically in terms of reproductive output.
right? So the odds of them of surviving to reproductive age and having offspring is lower compared to someone who has what we would call a beneficial mutation. And of course, mutations, again, or I should say, are context specific. So mutations are not for all time and place this will be a beneficial mutation, for all time and place this will be a harmful mutation, etc. Right? They're context specific.
obviously dependent on the environment, right?
Right, exactly.
Well, you say
I mean,
obviously, but a great many PhD biologists who are creationists seem to forget this fact routinely. So I think it's obvious, but
Well,
apparently people like John Sanford seem to forget this every single time they talk about it.
well, I'm not sure they forget about it. These are
Okay, then they're liars. That's fine too.
Well, no. What I'm saying is, we can recognize all of these things in adaptation within species, but to go
it's
from
funny that people like John Sanford don't. What I'm telling you is specifically creationist biologists frequently propose ideas that only work if you ignore the fact that the selection coefficient for mutations is context dependent, and that their ideas mathematically fall apart once you point that out.
Yeah, or what is the one where they claim? And now Dan's in the side chat, so if I say it wrong, I'm going to get yelled at. What's the? It was Sanford, wasn't it, who claimed that like there is no like there are just no beneficial mutations essentially, like
Yeah,
that just doesn't happen. So
basically, yeah. He also in addition to doing that, he
So
used the work of another geneticist, and the only way for him to make the conclusion that he did based on that geneticist's work is to either have badly misunderstood that geneticist, Moto Kimura,
hmm.
or to be lying about him. And so when I say that, like when you say these things are obvious, the reason I give pushback is because of how frequently people who agree with your broad position on science seem to treat these things as if not just that they're not obvious, but that they're outright false. And I find it interesting that you are not in agreement with that, because the thing is, there's a reason that they reject these things. And it's because if you don't, then most ideas that you can use to try to support creationist genetics just kind of don't work, like at all. But
Go ahead.
yeah, I guess we already got to selection. Well, I guess we can breeze through. So there's also sexual selection, where mate choice is a big thing. So the prettiest ones mate more. And then there's also drift, which is actually very important, but it involves the non-deterministic and rather stochastic effects of just sometimes you get lucky and you don't have as many kids, or you get unlucky and like I don't know, you're hit by a truck, and like there's probably not a genetic factor that's going to affect whether or not that's a good or a bad thing for you. And so yeah, now you're not reproducing anymore because you got hit by a truck. When all of that's taken together, where we have the origin of mutation, the origin of genetic diversity, and then it is acted on by both selection and drift, we get an overall trend of change in the genetics, and especially when it comes to selection, because that has to be based on the actual traits of an organism or its phenotype. That causes a change to the phenotype. Now, that's not always going to be anatomical, right? Your biochemistry is also part of your phenotype. So if, for instance, lactase persistence, which is basically your ability to keep eating dairy products without trouble later on in life, that doesn't have much of a morphological effect. Like you can't tell by looking at someone's like teeth or like the shape of their brow ridges or something whether or not they can digest dairy. So if you found like the skeletons of some dairy eaters and non-dairy eaters, you couldn't tell on the basis of their skeleton which one's which. So biochemistry also counts. So that's one of the things I also see a lot from creationists, is they'll say, well, these two organisms from different time periods look very similar, so I guess there wasn't any evolution. And you can't make that conclusion just based on gross morphology.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I'm just putting that in there.
Sure, yeah. What we're talking about is something that's observable, something that we can do with fruit flies today, right? Variation within species. That's all fine and good. We all recognize it.
Fruit flies have been speciated in labs. You can get yourself some fruit flies right now. Well, maybe not right now because you're on with us, but like before the week is out, you could get yourself the setup to do a speciation experiment with fruit flies. And granted, you probably have to let it run for about 5 years or so. And I feel like your wife might have an objection to having fruit fly tanks for 5 years. But like, if you could bypass
no,
that
baby,
somehow,
it's for science,
or overcome it somehow, or convince her that no, this really is great. Or hey, you know what? I don't know your wife. Maybe she really loves fruit fly experiments. That could be. But you could do it. You could get two groups of fruit flies that were originally part of the same population to become different species. Now,
well, they're different species of fruit flies, though.
Right, because that's how evolution works.
Yeah, so different species of fruit flies. So
right,
but
just like there are different species of insect and hexapod and crustacean and mandibulate.
Well, sure, we can find variabilities within species or kinds or however you want to put it.
But see, there's the rub. What's a kind?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not a scientific, we can see different kinds. There's human beings. There's only one kind of human being, right?
Well, maybe right now.
I mean, there in the fossil record, we have lots of different kinds of human beings.
Again, but that's the assumption that we evolved from those human beings.
I mean, it's not an assumption that they existed, right? We have their fossils and their DNA in some cases.
We have different fossils, but again, it doesn't make them different human beings. You and I'm sure we have different backgrounds.
So in some cases, we actually have their genetics. Like we have the genes of fossils. We have the genes of Neanderthals and Denisovans. We have their whole genomes. And we have like proteomic data from Homo erectus, which shows that these were definitely not Homo sapiens. Like we can literally just look at their genes and their proteins and say, okay, these are way different from anyone around today. Now, we're not descended from Neanderthals or Denisovans, although there was interbreeding between our populations because we have some of their DNA and they have some
So
of
yeah,
ours.
they can interbreed. So, but you can't have a dog interbreed with a cat, can you?
You can't have a dog interbreed with a fox either.
No, exactly, because they're different
So,
species.
okay, well, hold on a second. So, okay, so for one thing, species is species is also a term that is to a large extent arbitrary. So
Sure.
the general definition of species that most like high school and college kids get is you get the 1942 Mayer definition, which is a population capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring is considered one species. Well, that sort of doesn't work because there are lots of organisms that are considered different species because they occupy either different niches, they have different morphology, different like genes like chromosomal inversions or whatever. And in like 99% of cases or 99.9 they can't interbreed, but every so often they produce one like fertile hybrid or something. Like, yeah, that happens, but does that mean that they're the same species? I don't think so, and I don't think most biologists would agree because again, they occupy different niches, have different morphology, and all
Yeah,
that jazz. In
it's
some cases,
the liger problem, right? Some lion tiger crosses are fertile, some aren't.
and
Are they the same species? I would argue no.
right, and in some cases you get like really wacky hybrids. Like there was a paddlefish sturgeon hybrid. Now I don't think now the offspring. I have no idea if they even survived to adulthood. They at least were juveniles, but paddlefish and sturgeon are way different. They're in different families. Paddlefish are Polyodontidae, and then sturgeons are Acipenseridae. So yeah, they're different
Let's
families.
not let's not forget the humble hamster, which is in fact
Oh
a
yes,
human hamster hybrid, which is a real thing that has been created in labs.
yeah. So there used to be a fertility test where basically human sperm would be applied to a hamster egg, usually the Assyrian hamster, where the zona pellucida, which is this protein coat around the egg, was removed, and we could fertilize it, and it would undergo several divisions before crapping out. So
Well, sure, but such a thing doesn't take place naturally. Obviously,
Well, what's
there's
natural?
human interference.
So, well, I mean, in that case, like a lot of the things that are considered or that can hybridize wouldn't do it in nature, right?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
can we get a lion and tiger to interbreed? Sure. Is that a thing
Yeah.
that's going to
Does it happen in
happen?
the wild? There's never
No.
been a reliable recorded case of a liger in the wild.
Right. Like, same with like, was it camels and llamas or something like that? It's like,
Yeah.
can you get them to like cross fertilize? Yeah, sure, but you're right. That's not a thing that would normally happen. Now, however, the same could be applied with dogs, right? Can you get a Great Dane to fertilize a Chihuahua?
Maybe?
I'd be kind of shocked. We're talking about two things where the mechanical processes involved are very, very different.
Maybe if the Chihuahua is the male and it has a really good ladder.
But like that's the point. Like you see the point, right?
Yeah, I get your point. Yeah.
Okay.
So, but again, yeah, it's hard to define species, kind, whatever else it might be. But
Yes.
we do recognize distinctions between animals, right? I know that a fish is not a fly. I know that a bird is not a human.
Right.
There are similarities between the two, but I have no reason to believe that they came all from the same source,
So
which
okay.
is what evolution demands ultimately.
So
I can say there's variation within the species, but at the same time, I can recognize distinct species
Did we lose?
that they're very. I can look at the biblical account of creation and recognize God created
Well-
more than one kind of animal.
okay, so I want to clarify something because it seems like we're going. So the hybrid it matures but is sterile. Okay, cool. I didn't know that. So it seems like we're going back and forth on something, and I want to nail it down. So, are you of the position that new species can arise?
Again, how do you define species? I would say.
Well, so if we go with the definition that I provided, like the Mayer definition, if we go with that, we have observed populations where they lose reproductive, the ability to reproduce with each other. They become reproductively isolated.
Including with fruit flies.
Sure, by that definition, right? If I take fruit flies, I'm going to eventually have one group that can only reproduce with that same group. But am I going to be able to keep fruit flies around long enough, maybe over the course of 10,000 years, where one group of fruit flies evolves another set of legs, loses their wings, and becomes spider?
Well, you don't
I
have
have
to
no
do
evidence.
that.
Huh?
Well, that's not what we're asking, though, right? So
I know, but I'm talking about interspecies. So we're talking about within species, kind of however you want to do it, right? We can see it with dogs, but they're all still dogs. We can see it with certain kinds of insects, but they're all still insects.
Actually,
Where do we get from?
I-
Where do we get from a fish to a philosopher? How do we get from me? How do we get from wherever I came from to me plus something else?
So a couple
And
things.
that goes back to the
Okay.
question of origins, doesn't it?
Well,
Which
Not really.
not really, no. A
No.
couple things there. So when it comes to flies turning into spiders, I would encourage you to look into the flies called bat flies, because if there was ever a fly that turned into a spider, it's a bat fly. They didn't
Okay.
grow extra legs; they only have the 6 legs. But holy crap, do they look like spiders? Yeah, they are actually parasites. They're ectoparasites that feed on bats, and
Okay.
they generally don't have wings. Their head is radically reduced so that it's hard to even notice that it exists, and they have legs that, in gross morphology, closely resemble a lot of spider legs. In that they're like the spider legs of larvae, like a tarantula type thing. That they're relatively beefy and strong, and they're used to grip onto things mechanically because they can't really rely on things like van der Waals forces like some other flies can.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. In terms of fish and philosophers, I have never ever heard of a philosopher who was not an Osteichthian fish.
That's true.
Not one.
We're still fish today, right? Like, so all the characteristics that unite all fish, like, we are also included in, so we're more closely related genetically to some fish than those fish are to other fish. For instance,
Okay.
lungfish are more closely related genetically to all tetrapods, that's all amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, than they are to any other living fish,
including coelacanths.
including
So
coelacanths.
this gets back to our underlying presuppositions, though. I can look at that and recognize the same God created both using
So,
similar materials.
Here's
Where
why it
your
doesn't.
presupposition is we can't see this taking place in nature. I don't see a fish
So,
in active transformation.
There's a problem.
So
That is a testable hypothesis, and it has been tested, and
Okay.
it has already been falsified.
What's that?
So that these things could reasonably be explained by common ancestry with the separate ancestry, but common design, explaining the genetic similarities. The key there is that if you have separate ancestry, you can explain a lot of the similarity in functional DNA as a result of things like design criteria followed by purifying selection to keep those things working as intended. Which means that when it comes to things like protein coding regions, some regulatory regions, things like that, you can make a somewhat plausible argument that it's separate ancestry with common design, keeping those things conserved via selection. Okay, fair enough. But what you can't do is do that with non-functional regions. And we have tests for non-functionality. We know with extremely high confidence that most of the genome of most organisms is not actually functional. And in those regions, mutations simply accumulate according to the rules of genetic drift, right? So there's a rate at which mutations fix as a result of drift, which is then modified in functional regions by selection. But in the regions that aren't functional, it's not modified by that. And so if you have organisms with separate ancestry, even if they start with identical non-functional DNA sequences, the mutations that happen in one lineage will be uncorrelated with the mutations in the other, which means that if you just focus on non-functional DNA regions, you will not be able to recover any kind of nested hierarchy within separately created organisms because it's mathematically impossible.
Okay.
But the problem is that when we do that, we find that we recover essentially the same hierarchy as when we include functional regions. So we still find that in terms of neutral variation, humans share more with chimpanzees than with gorillas, and more with gorillas than orangutans, and more with orangutans than gibbons, and more with gibbons than, baboons, and more with baboons than with spider monkeys, and more with spider monkeys than with lemurs, and so on, until you get to the things like the lungfish and, heck, plants. It keeps on working, and it has the same basic topology as what we get when we look at morphology, or when we look at the whole genome, or if
developmental biology, or
So because of this fact, we have a test for separate ancestry, right? It's just ignore the functional stuff and only focus on the stuff that is being determined by drift. because that can't have correlated mutations across lineages. And if the lineages don't share a common ancestor, then they won't have any correlated mutations, except that they do. And other than a trickster god,
Wait,
who's like, I'm going to make it look like this.
That's an assumption that you can't prove.
That's just math.
No, that is just math.
Okay, well,
I mean, that is as much an assumption as 1 + 1 = 2.
Wait, what did you say, Alex? I didn't hear what you said.
Put it in layman's terms for me.
I got you. Okay, in fact, you know what? I'll use the Bible as an example because I like the Bible. I'm actually a really big fan of the Bible. I don't know if you know this. I really like. It's a very cool book on many grounds. I'm not going to tell you my theological stances, but did you know that we have what are called manuscript families?
Yes.
Okay. Also, I would actually expected that you would because you answered intelligently about the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, which means I know that you actually know stuff about the Bible, so that's good. Okay, so the way that manuscript families are detected, right, is because they share typographical changes that are transmitted vertically through, one scribe copies down the text, makes a mistake, the next scribe copies down his text, keeps that same mistake, and maybe introduces his own mistake, right?
Yep.
Now, in real life, the Bible has this check where if you're reading the text and it doesn't make any sense, you might go and check some other manuscript and use that as a correction, right? But let's pretend that we're in a scenario where that isn't happening, where anytime a scribe makes a mistake, no one is going to catch it, and it's just going to be carried forward, right?
Yep.
So that means we've removed that purifying check, just like natural selection and sexual selection can purify mutations that happen in functional regions. So effectively now, this Bible manuscript is occurring with just the neutral so-called drift changes to the text. Now, if you want to say that these two manuscripts that you have are part of a manuscript family and that they have a common ancestor text, which has these particular changes, but not these other ones that you only find in one codex versus the other, and the other ones that are only found in this other codex, right? But they have common changes that you presume are from the ancestor codex. That's great. But if you had two different codices that had no correlated changes at all with other codices, and instead their variations were just completely uncorrelated, not only would you have to say that you had a new manuscript family, you would have one that you could not trace back to a reconstructible ancestor text, unlike what you could with most of the other manuscript families. And so what I'm saying is that a similar thing is happening in organisms, where we say, even if we have identical original neutral mutation in what seem like related organisms, the subsequent mutations wouldn't be correlated, and you couldn't construct an ancestor in an intermediate ancestor before just identical text. You would have to start with identical text. But what we actually find is that all across life in these non-functional areas where these mutations or textual changes just build up as a result of drift, what we actually find is that we can always reconstruct a previous genome that would be possessed by an ancestor genome. Just like we could, in my scenario with the Bible, reconstruct an ancestor text. And that, in fact, that's a big reason why we have things like critical editions of the Bible, right? Where we say, okay, there's like 3 different readings of this verse. Here's the one that seems like the most likely to be original. Here's why, right? We can do that same thing with genetics. And we can do it across groups in neutral DNA that isn't purified, that according to virtually every creationist I've ever heard of, shouldn't be considered to be related, like humans and other apes, or humans and other primates, or humans and rodents, or humans and bats. I don't know, at that point I was just pulling one out of the air. Sorry.
Pulling a bat out of the air?
Yeah.
You had a comment about a trickster god, saying a god wouldn't do that unless he was trying to deceive us in some way.
Well, I guess I'm not going to try to impart comprehensible human motives onto a god who perhaps should be approached apophatically in terms of human language. But I will say that the effect of such a divine action to basically create correlated neutral mutations would be that it would deceive humans once they got to the point where they could notice such things.
But again, it's the assumption that they're correlated mutations when that could in fact just be the building blocks which God used.
But that's the thing. If that's the case,
and it ultimately depends on our worldview, where
it doesn't.
Yes, it does.
Well,
I can look at it with the worldview that the Word of God is true, recognizing that creatures were
But that's the
created
thing.
distinct from one another, but by the same God and in an
If
organized.
you allow the God who will arrange everything to look as if it is not how it is, that
What do you
means
mean, as if it is not what it is? He arranged
So
it the way it
we
is.
know how these processes work, and we can make predictions about how these processes play out over time. Is what Dapper has been talking about. And so,
Right.
if it turns out that that just isn't how it works, like
and
that's
God just
like
made it to look that way.
yeah, God just wanted to like okay, so we'll have this exact same insertion in the exact same place as chimpanzees, but actually, God just wanted to do that. Like
Right.
that seems trickster. That seems deceptive, right?
Right. And it has the effect of deceiving us. And it also means that we, at that point, don't have a good reason to believe in any allegedly revealed text, because the same God that is apparently revealing it is the same one who will lie to us in terms of biology. Now, like I said, I am not trying to impart these motives to God.
Can I counter that?
Well, let me finish my quick caveat so it doesn't
Sure.
seem like I'm trying to be a jerk.
Yeah.
I do want to point out that I recognize the importance of things like apophatic theology and the essentially inscrutable nature of God as compared to humans in terms of most Christian conceptions of God. So I'm not trying to impart a malicious intent on God, but what I am saying is that is the effect.
Well, it would be the effect if you look at it apart from a Christian worldview. And here's kind of how I would counter it. In the same way where if I were on, let's say, the shore of Galilee at the point in time where Jesus multiplied the fish and the loaves, right?
Mhm.
And I were handed a piece of that fish. I wasn't told where it came from. I was asked to determine where it came from, right? I would
Right.
look at it. I'd be able to determine by that fish, okay, what species is it? I'd be able to perhaps look at what that fish ate. I'd be able to look at how old
I
that
actually
fish
don't
was
know
when
that that's
it was
true.
killed. Well, if it's real fish, then we should be able to do that. God can create that, can't he?
So the thing is, if we assume the literal truth of the couple feeding of the 1,000 stories, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what you would find if you looked at that fish under a microscope. I know the people there perceived it to be fish, according to the story, but actually
it
don't
says
know that it would
says
have.
it says it was fish, though.
But the
Was
thing
it
is,
just
I
not
I
fish?
don't know how to answer the question. What would happen if I looked at the gut contents of that fish?
Well,
I would actually predict that it would just be empty, because if it were full of a meal that fish never ate, then God is creating things that go beyond the purpose of his miracle here, and instead is inserting an entire history to a fish that never actually existed, that is unnecessary to the goal of feeding people. And
So-
a God who does that, I would say, well, I'm not going to speak to that God's motives. The effect of that would in fact be broad trickery.
And that's what I'm arguing. It's not trickery for God to create a fish that never lived, or to create bread out of wheat that never had to grow. That's not trickery at all.
It's
That's
not
an
just
aspect
that.
of creation.
Well, it's not just that they're being created; is that they're being created with an apparent history.
Right.
Is the issue.
So
An unnecessary apparent
and we
history.
can look at Adam. He was created. If he were to be tested by a doctor
Well,
today,
I mean, that's kind of what we're.
again, that that's why it is all a matter of worldview.
Okay, so let's say Adam is created. Would
It is
Adam
a
have
matter of worldview.
scars and evidence of broken bones that were broken and healed before he was created?
I wouldn't say we would find that. I'm not saying it's out of the.
Well, that's what I'm saying too, right? I'm saying that if God had done that, if he had given Adam a history of like a scar from having been burned when he was 6,
but there's a difference between a not something like a scar and then just how my DNA is structured, right?
But that's the thing. There isn't, in the sense of it provides an evident history, right?
So,
but all I care about is the evident history. If you don't think God would create Adam with the results of injuries that never occurred, why would he create living things with the results of mutations that never occurred?
Well, God can create, again, it goes back to believing the account that God created all things.
The question isn't God's ability. The question is, does your reading of, or does your concept of God allow for that level of evident dishonesty about the past?
It's not dishonesty, though. That's a moral claim, right? I wouldn't say it's dishonesty.
I don't think dishonesty is honest.
God does not lie.
That doesn't really have anything to do with.
Well, I mean, God manifestly does lie. He says deceiving
so-
spirits. He doesn't. What he says to Adam in the Genesis 2 actually doesn't come true. I mean, Now, you could argue that God is not broadly to be characterized as a dishonest actor in the Bible, and I would tend to agree that, yeah, God is not broadly a dishonest actor. But I mean, he absolutely lies in the Bible.
Okay, so again, that's an assumption that you have.
No, it's just the text.
Okay, tell me a place. You mentioned Genesis 2, right? You're assuming when God says death, he means that, and you would understand death as always physical, right? Where scripture teaches the wages of sin is death. Scripture teaches that there is a second death, the lake of fire. Scripture teaches that death is separation from God. Jesus, would said we are dead in our trespasses and sins. So I can look at it within the context of all of scripture and recognize, yeah, God did not lie. God is being completely honest. It did not happen in the way that we might expect from our limited perspective. Or if I have a worldview that says, yeah, God in fact can lie, or death must mean physical death, then yeah, I'm going to come to the conclusion that God can lie. But if I'm looking at it from the perspective that what God says and reveals of himself and of nature is true, then I can hold all that together.
So in Genesis 2:17, the thing that God says roughly translates to, and dying you shall die, right?
Yep.
It's using this particular form. And the thing is, this form actually occurs in many places in Hebrew literature. This is not an isolated form. To propose that this is actually not a promise of physical death on a particular day would mean that every other time that it's used, it is being used differently in this particular point in Genesis 2:17 than it is being used every other point in known Hebrew literature where we can determine how it's being used with other evidence, right? Every time we can see, and dying you shall die, it is in reference to things like a proposed date of execution, or the actual death of someone, like the actual day on which someone dies, or their actual physical death. It is hard for the Genesis 2:17 to be less ambiguous than it is right now in saying, on the day, so within a 24-hour time period, in which you eat thereof, the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall die. And when it says, dying you shall die,
yep,
it very explicitly is precluding those other areas, unless we want to argue that the rules of how Hebrew idioms work changed that time. Now, you could argue that, I suppose.
And again,
that's fantastically implausible.
There are other ways that you can understand it, right? But okay.
Yeah, if you wanted to ignore how that phrase works in Hebrew, sure.
Not necessarily. If we look at it in the context of the entirety of Scripture, we do see that there is a death that does take place. However, it's a substitutionary death.
Which isn't what's promised in 2:17.
Again, just as the wages of sin is death, God has promised the soul that sins will die. I have sinned, right?
Great.
Except God has laid my sin on another. There is another who died in my place, the Lord Jesus Christ.
And that was not described as Alex
we can see a theme
beginning.
So again, we can see a theme beginning in Genesis.
I think, Alex, I think you're missing the point. Dapper is saying that the language specifically here is not the same as the language that you're using for those other examples. When
I'm not looking at other examples. What I'm talking about.
When you say the wage of sin is death, you're looking at a different like, I guess, etymological
is physical
usage
death the result of sin?
So
I'm not here to have that theological discussion. If you want to say yes,
I know. Okay. So that's why I can look at when God says, "The day you eat of this, you shall die." I can look at it in a theological and typological way.
Are you looking at it with like the Hebrew as like Dapper's looking at it, or are you looking at it as like the English?
Look, I'm also not asking you to not.
It doesn't matter which way you look at it, right? You can look at it in a typological way. The Bible uses types all the time.
Right. I'm not asking you to not look at it typologically. What I am saying is that when it comes to the literal meaning of the text, not the typological inferences that you can draw from it, when it comes to the literal meaning of that text, what God said to Adam would happen didn't happen.
Okay.
Now, typologically, sure, great. Have as many typological discussions about that as you want, but in the literal meaning of that text.
So you're saying that's an example of God being deceptive?
Well, there's only two options that I can see. Either God lied or he changed his mind. Now, if you want to go with God being an omniscient, perfect being, I see it hard. It would be hard for me to understand how he changed his mind in that instance. Now, if you want to abandon omnipotence and or being perfect,
you don't even have to go there. But let me provide an example for you. If I tell my child I'm leaving without you, what am I doing?
Well,
Do I lie? Was that a lie when I do not leave without my child after he rushes out to the van?
so if you say, if you don't X or Y, I'm leaving without you, and then they do not X or Y, and you still wait anyway, then yes, you're lying.
Okay. So, and that's where we would define lie differently.
Well, to me, a lie is an attempt to convince someone else of something that is not true.
Okay. And how do you define lie?
Like that,
That's what he,
I mean,
that was
Okay.
his
So,
definition.
but again, is that an objective definition or is that just your definition?
well, I mean, that is a definition that is in concordance with most philosophers when it comes to things like moral philosophy. What is a lie? Are lies wrong? Are they always wrong? When are they okay? When it
Okay,
comes to the discussion
so
of moral philosophy, a lie is broadly, in most places, defined in the sense that it is an attempt to convince another person of something that is not true, that is an intentional attempt. So if you accidentally mislead someone, not a lie. If you believe something and you tell that to someone to convince them of that thing that you believe is true, even if it's not true, not a lie. You have to intend to convince someone of something you believe not to be true. And if you do that, you have lied.
okay, so when God told Nineveh in 40 days you will be overthrown, was he lying?
Yes.
Okay. So, and again, that's where we would define lie differently. I can look at lie as it's defined in scripture because scripture is my ultimate standard.
I'm not
Because,
aware of scripture giving a definition. Where is it that it has a definition for lying?
well, it doesn't necessarily give a definition, but
Oh,
you can look throughout scripture and come to a definition, right? When you take all that God says regarding bearing false witness and also what God says about his own nature, and then look at the actions of God, also presupposing, as I do, that all of scripture is consistent with itself, that's where you would
well,
disagree, right?
I mean, it manifestly isn't, but okay.
So again, that's another presupposition. You say it, I
No,
say
it's
it
just
is,
the
you say it
conclusion
isn't.
of not. It's just the conclusion of looking at the text without presupposing that it is always consistent with itself. The
Well,
only way to come to the conclusion that it is to start with that as your premise. If you
yeah,
don't start with that as your premise,
I
like
start
great.
with what God has said as my premise, right?
Well, I mean that can be your premise, but you can't say that the other conclusion is only the premise of assuming the opposite. It's not. That is the conclusion that you come to anytime you do not assume the univocality of the text. If
Wait,
you just
so if I don't presume that the word of, and again, that goes to human, that also goes to what the word of God teaches about human nature, right? If I don't presume that the word of God is consistent with itself, of course I'm going to find inconsistencies, especially considering
yeah,
the fact that I'm in rebellion against God and don't believe his word naturally as a fallen son of Adam.
rebellion or not, if God had wanted to make a consistent text that was consistent whether or not you assumed that it would be at the outset, he could have.
Well, again, you can make anything seem inconsistent, can't you?
No, you can only
No.
make things seem inconsistent if they seem to be inconsistent. For instance, if I write a short story about a kid who got some money from his mom, took a bike to the corner shop, bought some hard candy, and rode his bike back, I could write that completely free of inconsistencies. Now,
Okay.
granted, the longer the text is, the more likely it is that I will write something that seems inconsistent. So, I mean, but that's because I'm a
And as it's
limited.
and the Bible is a really long library of books,
Right.
right?
That is
So the
full
more
of.
information there is, the more you can find places that could seem inconsistent.
Right. Which is why when I say that the Bible is not perfectly consistent with itself, that is a thing that is true and is demonstrably true unless you start out with the otherwise, as far as I can tell, unjustified assumption that it has to be consistent with itself and you are willing to twist anything possible in order to get to that conclusion. So, for
So
instance, when the Bible says that different numbers of people were in a particular army, well, you can twist that. When it says that God doesn't lie, even though he does things like sends deceiving spirits, says that things will happen that don't then happen without giving any kind of caveats as to how to avoid them. When you do these things, right, what you are doing is you are allowing your prior assumption about the Bible to rule over the Bible itself, and you're not allowing the Bible to speak on its own terms, which you can do. I'm not going
but
to stop you from doing. I don't really care that much,
but the
but
Bible in its own
that is what
terms
you're doing.
says it's consistent with itself. So if I read it in a way
Does it
where
though?
it does, yeah.
Where?
it says all of Scripture is God breathed, right?
Yes, it does say God. All of Scripture is God breathed. But here's the problem with that. That word didn't actually mean that it was provided by God until fairly late into the Christian or into the early Christian period. Until then, theopneustos means in earlier Greek literature and as well as later post-biblical Greek literature, all the way into the first few centuries CE. What it actually means is life-giving. All Scripture, which by the way, the thing meant by Scripture in that cannot have been the Bible, because the Bible had neither been recognized as a set of books at that point, nor had the set of books currently in the Bible all been written at the point that was written down. So it absolutely does not mean that all the Bible is inspired in that sense and therefore self-consistent. What it means is that all of the Scriptures, which that author almost certainly would have meant just what we now think of as the Old Testament, but also probably most of what we now think of as the Apocrypha, because that was in the Septuagint that was being used by the early Christians as their set of Scriptures. All of that is life-giving. It is able to give you edification so that you can lead a better life.
But is that how Paul is using it, though? Because word is always defined by its usage. Unfortunately, it's hapla. It's only used once in the New Testament, right? But we can look at the rest of
elsewhere in Greek literature, where it does not.
It's used elsewhere in church history, but we have to ultimately look first at the New Testament, the rest of Scripture.
But we also need to look at other instances of pneumus. I can't talk. Sorry.
Again, and in the culture, there's other uses of the word logos, where
which also the author of the Gospel of John brings in. That's how we know what he's talking about when he says things like "enarche en ho logos, kai ho logos en enarche en ho logos, kai logos ton proston theon," something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head. Sorry about that. I don't have John 1:1 in front of me. But when he uses logos in that sense, right? The reason we understand it at all is because we can look at contemporary uses of the word logos to mean things like a divine organizing principle from people like, Greek philosophers, bringing in this idea that the world is organized by this organizing principle that they call the logos, which then the author of the Gospel of John brings in to describe Jesus. That's how we know how that works.
You presume he brings that in, but the word logos is found frequently throughout the Old Testament to describe God speaking to someone. I mean, so what's more likely that a Middle Eastern Jew would draw from the pagan cultures around him, or that he would draw from his own literature in order
to use his word? That literature that uses logos in the Old Testament is specifically the Septuagint, which was translated.
The translation. That's the Bible they would have been using.
But who translated the Septuagint? It was Hellenistic Jews who were using their knowledge of Greek and how it was used by Greeks in order to produce a version of their scriptures in that language. So they are also drawing on ancient Greek use of the word logos, just like the author of the Gospel of John is.
So when the translators of the Septuagint read the word of the Lord came to such and such, when they read that word, they were immediately importing in all kinds of Greek concepts and things like that?
So I can't say for certain exactly what they're doing.
That's a presumption that you have. But
let me answer the question, Alex. Right?
Yep.
Let me actually answer the question.
Go ahead. Sorry.
So here's what I can say. The word logos is extremely polysemous, right? It has a lot of different meanings that are important in different contexts. But what I can say for certain is that at least sometimes it was being brought in simply to translate the word as in an identifiable unit of speech that has an encoded complete meaning that can be strung in together as part of a sentence, right? And that has like phonotactic boundaries that can be maintained in the language. That is one of the things that happen and places in the Septuagint. But I will also say that those translators were very much aware of the other uses. And so when they use the word logos, they very well can use it in ways that are including things like, this is the word of the Lord, that imports with it these philosophical ideas about this word of the Lord is what is being an organizing principle. Now, it doesn't have to be on the entire universe. No, in the case of the word of the Lord, it's more often things like introducing like bits of legislation, concluding bits of legislation or bits of prophecy. But you're still able to import that meaning of an organizing principle onto either, say, the entire nation of Israel when you're looking at legislative portions, or at least onto the current context of the prophetic pronouncement. Because, the current prophetic pronouncements are usually given as warnings, especially to like government type people like kings and emperors and whatnot, about, hey, you're screwing up, please don't screw up, or God will be angry. And that becomes the organizing principle there. We don't have to ignore the wider context of the word logos to also acknowledge the relatively mundane use of it in the Septuagint. And further, we know that at least in John, John is not using this word to simply mean like that speech utterance that has those phonotactic boundaries and a semantic content. Like, he's clearly not doing that.
Well, there's a lot to get into, but Andreas Kostenberger, a great scholar on this, makes a pretty good argument for that. And the reason that's brought up, huh?
What's the that? Sorry, I'm a little lost.
For word being defined according to its most immediate context, which he would argue would be those Old Testament scriptures. That's what John would be utilizing as he is writing. That's what his audience would be most familiar with, rather than the Greek philosophical usage of the word logos.
So are you saying that you think the most plausible reading of the prologue to the Gospel of John is that Jesus is a prophetic announcement that is going to order the affairs of various polities in the ancient past, or that he is the legislative framework that is going to organize the civil life of the people of Israel? That's the meaning that you want to take out of this.
No, that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is, whenever we come across that word, the word of the Lord came to such and said this. And when we read of the word in John chapter 1, the word is with God, the word was God, he's in the beginning with God. No one has seen God at any time, but the only begotten God who's in the bosom of the Father, which is in reference to the word. He has explained him, or he has revealed him. So when God reveals himself, he does so through speech, right?
But Jesus isn't speech. Jesus
is not speech. That's not what I'm saying.
So then we can't use that earlier thing, because the word of the Lord in those contexts is always speech, right? God directs
the word of the Lord. The word of the Lord came and said. So, right.
So are you saying that every time the word of the Lord appears, that is a pre-incarnation appearance of Christ in the Old Testament?
Not necessarily an appearance, but a revelation of him, either through word or in person, right? Sometimes the word of the Lord comes and we see it spoken through someone like the leader of the army of Jericho,
but that guy,
leader of the Lord's army, for instance.
But that guy isn't Jesus, right? When the word of the Lord comes, what we actually see in the Old Testament is it coming through a prophet who isn't Jesus.
Unless you want to argue that all prophet, but where does that prophet get that word? He didn't just make it up.
Well, that's the thing. If it's coming through Jesus, then it's coming through Jesus in some apparently non-corporeal way, because no one reports.
Yeah, yeah, that's fine. Jesus in a non-corporeal way, but when we look at the word of the Lord, it comes from the Lord. And the point of John in the prologue of John is to establish the deity of Christ, to establish that Christ, whenever God speaks, it is Christ speaking, since no one has seen God at any time speaking of
I just realized we left Jackson behind a while ago.
Yeah.
I've just been enjoying listening to you, Dapper.
Okay,
but I don't know anything about theology or philosophy. So.
I will say it is refreshing to actually talk to a young Earth creationist who, when I actually engage on the level of things like primary sources and original language, actually has something intelligible to say. Because so often they're just like, well, I don't know any Greek or Hebrew, which isn't that's not a slight on them, right? There's no reason you have to know Greek or Hebrew. It's just nice to sometimes find someone who does know a bit. I'll say this. I don't think we're going to get anywhere on this particular topic. I will say my stance remains, one, that I do think that the authors of the Greek New Testament were perfectly able and actually did draw on wider Greek culture in order to use their language. In fact, which authors of the Septuagint also did, in my opinion. You are free to disagree with that, and I don't think this is going to be the place where we hash that out. But my conclusion, which I know you disagree with, is also that if you come to the Bible without the presupposition that it is going to be univocal and literally true, you do not find that those things are plausible readings. You're welcome to disagree that those are not plausible readings. But I still am not sure how it is that we're getting to. Well, let me reframe the topic in terms of the science, right? If everything we find about the natural world indicates a false history, right? A history that didn't occur, but that is
a false history only according to your worldview.
Well, let me finish this bit, right?
Yep.
So, for instance, we see supernovas that are farther away than a 6,000-year-old age of the universe would allow, which means that if that light was created in transit, that explosion never really happened, right? A movie of that explosion is what's been recorded in the light. and we see organisms that, by all testable means, are compatible with our predictions for common ancestry, but incompatible with our predictions for separate ancestry if we do not have an evident history that didn't occur. What is science supposed to do in a case where there is an evident history all around us, right? In the rocks, in the genetics of organisms, in the sky, everywhere. There is this evidence of a history that apparently may not have happened if we take certain aspects of the Bible both seriously and literally. What do you do with science? Because my conclusion would be, we'll just treat the universe as if it's as old and has the history that it seems to, even if it doesn't, right? Because that's still what's going to get us useful predictions, right? That's what's going to let us do things like have successful oil wells drilled. That's what's going to let us do things like successfully predict what kinds of rocks we'll find on Mars when we go there. It's the kind of thing that will let us do things like successfully predict about how long Betelgeuse has to go before it goes kablooey, right?
No, science, like we've said, science is the observation of creation around us, obviously. However, there's a distinction between an interpretation of the evidence and the evidence itself, right?
Okay.
So, and I believe in a special creation, a supernatural creation. Therefore, there's not a scientific explanation for it. There is
Okay.
a supernatural explanation for it, and my worldview allows for that. So when I look at the various species,
But I'm not asking what you should do. I'm asking what should science do, right?
what should science do?
Right. Science has this evident history that seems to be what the evidence is showing if we just look at it on the basis of the evidence itself without backing up to include.
But evidence itself doesn't say
Alex,
anything
please.
apart from the worldview.
I've been very careful to try not to interrupt.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Forgive me.
Yeah, okay. I do forgive you, because you know what? I'll be honest. When we started this, especially in the pre-show, I gotta say, I think you're a cool guy, Alex. Like, for one thing, you share my taste in Monster energy drinks, so it can't be all bad, right? So I do forgive you, and yeah, we'll move on. So, what should science do as science if it has all this evidence that there is a past history to the universe, and using that evidence to make predictions about future finds is successful? Should it pretend that that evidence isn't there and is useful predictively because of a theological commitment, or should it continue on as if that evident history is real, given that that provides for actual success in predictions in science, which it manifestly does, right? Virtually every oil well that's ever been drilled in like the past 100 years or so has used things from like geology and paleontology to determine rock ages to figure out where there can and can't be oil.
Right,
The oil industry currently would collapse. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Were you saying something, Jackson?
No, I say go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah. I'll shut up.
Well, again, science is the observation of what we have here and now, right? Science doesn't tell us. It's only when we interpret the findings of science that we come to certain conclusions about history and things like that. Now, I can reach something like an oil well or something through a faulty understanding, right? Where we have the evidence before us that lays out certain geographical features. I would say it's a result of God's creation, and God created things in an ordered way. Therefore, because God created things in an ordered way, we should expect things to be consistent with themselves. Where you might appeal to millions and millions of years and things like that. We might reach the same conclusion, or we might reach the same oil well. But we have different foundations for getting there. But I would say that science, apart from a Christian worldview, has really no justification or no grounding for anything, for expecting the uniformity of nature, for expecting things like that, without appealing to things like a special ordered creation. I know that nature is going to be uniform. I know that things are going to work in an ordered fashion because of the nature of the God who created it. Science has to assume these certain things. But
I don't super want to interrupt you, but I might actually want to agree with you somewhere that you might find surprising.
Okay, go ahead.
I actually do agree that we don't particularly have a philosophical grounding for the uniformity of nature in science. I think that is simply an axiomatic assumption in science that is not even, like, justification isn't even sought for it. But I also don't think that that's necessarily a problem for science, because we do the same thing in math, and no one really complains about like the basic axioms of math. So
No, science. Yeah, we use math, we use science, whether you're a Christian or an atheist, right? But it's only from a Christian worldview that I can explain why we do these things. Because we were created by God, we were created in His image, we have a special creation, we were
okay,
created to look for certain patterns and things like that. If the universe truly is random, and if we are the result of simply randomness, then there would be no reason for reason. There would be no reason for order. There would be no reason for any of these things except we seek them.
okay.
So,
So
so I
have a
do want to
quick
point
question
out
about
that
oil.
there
sorry.
are actually, that was where I was going, because I want to
Oh, okay.
return to the oil issue. So there are zero oil companies that use like young Earth creationism to find oil. There aren't any.
Zero, or is it one?
Okay, fine. There's one that finds no oil. The
Right.
Zion Oil and Gas. Okay, but aside from them, there are
Well,
no
I want to
companies.
repeat. How much oil have they successfully found while using the Bible as their guidebook?
Zero.
None.
Yeah,
None
none.
oil.
There,
Okay.
there are no oil. There's no. There are no young Earth creationist oil companies because young Earth creationism doesn't work. Right? It's like, I mean, you can say that. You can say, oh well, maybe we could use faulty methods to find oil. Good luck. You have a lot of money if you're just digging random, holes out, in the
Yeah.
middle of nowhere.
The average oil company is only a
No,
handful of dry wells away
No
from
one does that.
no,
Yeah,
no,
no
no.
one does that.
What I'm hold on. I don't want you to misunderstand me. What I'm not saying is, hey, you know what? I'm going to ignore geographical features. I'm going to ignore the patterns that I see in nature. I'm just going to look at the Bible and hope I can find some kind of secret code that'll give me geographical
Right.
coordinates
Well,
for
no.
oil.
I
Right?
understand. I understand what you're
That's
saying.
silly.
Like, you're right. You're not right. Okay, I see what you're saying. But however, what I'm saying is young Earth creationism, like trying to build from a young Earth and trying to put everything in nature into that young Earth does not allow you to find oil. Like, there's no way to interpret the sedimentary layers of the earth in such a way that young Earth creationism is true and also allows you to find oil. Like, that just doesn't happen. And in part for the reasons that we've talked about earlier, like index fossils actually play a role in finding oil because you have to know like the age of your strata. You have to know like what kind of depositional environment is this strata forming under, because that's going to impact the oil, where the oil is, all that sort of stuff. So again, to go back to like what we were talking about earlier, there are no mechanisms by which strata form and fossils are laid down in particular strata that are there that have been proposed by young Earth creationists that work and allow us to find oil, or even explain the diversity of organisms in the rock record. Like that, I mean, that's what we were talking about earlier, right? There just aren't any. It's not, and if you want to come up with a mechanism, okay, well and good, and test it and get it published in the literature, and that's great. But we don't have that yet. We
Again,
do have,
and again, that's not my field. I don't want to get overly technical.
and so the people who
Okay, but
do try
real
to do
quick,
that sort of stuff, like
it is
they,
someone's field. It's a whole bunch of people's field, and they've
It's a
had
whole bunch
zero
of people's
success.
fields, right? And
But they've had
probably-
zero success.
Huh?
No one is looking to Andrew Snelling to figure out where to drill for oil, right? No one is looking at Steve Austin, the creationist, not Steve Austin, the $6 million man or the wrestler, to figure out. Well, I mean, I guess no one's looking at those two either. But none of the Steve Austins, as far as I know, are being looked to figure out where to find oil. No one is looking at like there's a whole bunch of quote unquote flood geologists, right? No one is looking at any of them to find out where any kind of mineral wealth is. They're not asking them about where to find ore deposits. They're not asking them about where to find oil, coal, anything, right? The only exception is that people used to do that for Andrew Snelling, but that's back when he was publishing things
for an actual, for literature,
for actual literature, where he was actually in the mainstream of science and accepting all of the old age dates that he got from radiometric dating and stratigraphy, and wasn't doing anything that was consistent with young Earth creationism. When he started doing young Earth creationist geology, suddenly he stopped working for mineral exploration companies as some kind of weird coincidence, I guess. Because you would think if he were more right about geology, being a young Earth flood geologist, that instead he would be better at finding minerals on that basis. But he's obviously not. So
Well, again, this gets to the point of we can look at the same evidence and see the same patterns,
But we're
right?
not.
But that's the thing. Yeah.
Hold on,
We're
hold
not
on a
doing.
second. Can a young Earth creationist, without presuming any kind of age, let's pretend I'm a super old Earth creationist. I believe the Earth is 10 trillion years old. The
Okay.
strata that you're looking at now is 80 billion years old. Can I look at the same strata and the same rock formations and look at the patterns that are found in it and look at the oil, be completely wrong about the age, but still follow those patterns that we find in creation and reach the same conclusions?
Well, here's what I'll say. I don't know if you can, but I'm not aware of anyone who has. And
Right.
of the people who have abandoned geology in favor of flood geology, none of them have been able to then, on that basis, successfully predict where economically significant mineral resources are in any case.
Yeah.
So
Okay, yeah,
when
and
when people take young Earth creationism and flood geology as their operating principle for geology, their
and
geology becomes useless and unable to successfully predict future data.
and again, I don't want to presume every geographical related thing is because of the flood. What I'm saying is I don't know. I have a framework
Sure.
for understanding some things. I could be wrong that something is a result of the flood and it happened by some other means, right? But the point is the presupposition that I have of a biblical worldview. But we go back to the uniformity of nature and things like that. I have a basis on which I can believe nature is uniform. I have a
Okay.
basis on which I can look at these things. I can look at the patterns in the rocks and understand that oil appears at a certain strata and around these certain formations and whatever else, right? Because of the uniformity of nature, because of the God that holds it all together.
So
But oil can be like both at the surface and like deep underground.
Sure,
Yeah.
and I'm not an expert in it. I'm using this for the sake
and
of
the thing
argument.
is, you
Okay?
say you
So-
can, but no one ever has, right? Despite there being a whole lot of young Earth creationists out there who are
but
don't concern themselves about like the,
my point is, can I look at a certain strata, make absolutely no assumption on the age, just simply following the patterns of the strata? Right? Do people, as they find oil, say, "Oh yeah, we"? Is it based on certain strata being a certain age, or being in a
yes,
certain, or is
yes,
that,
it is explicitly
and we
that we
and we and we know or assume the age based on how it is
we
structured,
no,
right?
we Jackson and I know people who work in oil exploration professionally
Yes.
as geologists. When they go around doing basin modeling to find where oil is, they need to determine the age of the strata through a combination of things like index fossils to get a rough idea, followed by radiometric dating to actually pinpoint the age of things. And if things are the wrong age, they do not recommend drilling because they know that they will not find
Right.
oil at the target depth. This is
So again, but
the age of the
I
strata
can look
is
at I can
neither assumed. Let me real quick. The age of the strata is neither assumed nor is it irrelevant. It is extremely important to finding oil, and it is measured. It is not assumed.
so
Go ahead.
it's assumed based off of, or
Nope.
not, sorry, it is determined based off of assumptions that radiometric dating and that certain creatures are at a certain age.
Radiometric dating. Here's the assumption of radiometric dating:
Okay.
the uniformity of nature.
Yep.
That's
Which
it.
you can't account for with your worldview.
So
Except
again,
we
remember
already
we
told you
said
there's-
earlier we're willing to be Christians for this conversation, and so we
But then
agree that
I'm
nature is
saying, if
uniform.
you're willing to
For
be
all Alex
Christian,
knows, I'm Christian all the time.
Sure.
I'll say
right.
then, if you're willing to be Christians, then you can't have it both ways. You're trying to steal from my worldview for a worldview.
No, it's
that you
our
don't-
worldview. It's
Yeah,
our
it's
worldview.
Our worldview, comrade. Yeah.
So if it's our worldview, then there's no problem with acknowledging that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, all the creatures that are in it.
See, there's the thing.
That
is not
everything we have now is
universal.
a result of God's special creation.
Here's the thing. You know that there are Christians who disagree with you about creation and when it occurred and how long it took, right? Like you're
I
aware
know
of
that,
this.
and I would
Okay.
argue that they're inconsistent, that they
That's
are
great.
compromising on certain aspects.
But when I
of the
say
God.
I'm for at least for the purposes of this conversation and for all you know all the time, a Christian, what I am saying is I am willing to at least assent to like the mere Christianity that C.S. Lewis is going to put out there, right? Which does not include the age of the earth. It does not include anti-evolutionism. I'm assuming you've read Mere Christianity.
Yep.
If I say I'm willing to go that far, and then maybe I'm willing to go into one of the rooms that he has described in his, mansion metaphor, where Christianity is a big house and the different ecclesial bodies are the different rooms that you might enter, and he's just trying to get you into the big house. All I'm saying is I made it to the big house, right? I'm in the house that has a bunch of rooms, which I could go into. I'm not telling you if I have or which one I might have gone into.
But what I see is what I see what you're doing. I see what you're doing is running away from the problem.
What's the problem?
The problem such as the uniformity of nature, that from non-life can come life, from simplicity can come complexity.
What makes you think I'm running?
Huh?
What do you think I'm running?
Because you're saying I'm going to we can pretend that I'll pretend right now that I'm a Christian so I can assume the uniformity of nature.
What makes you think I'm pretending? You actually don't know me.
I don't know you.
Jackson doesn't even know if I'm a Christian or not.
Yeah, I'm sorry but what I'm saying is, if we are going to argue from naturalism, right? A supernatural worldview.
I'm not arguing from naturalism.
Okay, a supernatural worldview can account for things like apparent age, right?
Okay.
And we talked about that. You say it's deceptive.
Right, it is.
And I would argue it's not, because the same God who does not lie is the same God who created the heavens and the earth in 6 days.
I mean, right? Unless we actually point to instances where God has lied, because again,
and that's the assumption that those are lies.
Well, they are evidently intentional on the part of God because he chooses to do these things, and they are convincing people of. In fact, even in the Jonah example, right? When Jonah goes to Nineveh and says, "In 40 days you're going to be destroyed," when the king says, "Hey, I don't think it'll work, but let's repent anyway, just in case God changes his mind," and then it does work. In the context, there's only two options. Either God changed his mind, which is weird for an omniscient, perfect being to do, or he was lying about the 40 days in the first place in order to scare them into repenting.
Or can God say certain things to inspire certain reactions? The same way I would do it with my children? I mean, am I being malicious when I do that?
Well, I don't have maliciousness. Maliciousness is not coming into it. That's also an assumption.
Yeah, so a lie can be perfectly benevolent, right? Like the famous example is, the early 1940s German soldiers come knocking on your door. Hey, got any Jews in the attic? And you say no, even though you do. That is in no way malicious. You are saving people's lives by doing that. If you want to say that God lies in order to save people's lives, at least in the case of Nineveh, if you take that story as a literal historical thing that happened, then I would say, yeah, that seems to be the reason he lied there. I'm not going to complain about that, but it still is God lying. It is him attempting to convince people of something that is not true in order to get them to do the thing that he wants them to do, which is basically what lies are for, right? Like, why would you lie to someone if you didn't expect them to then behave as if your lie were true? Like, that would just be a weird kind of pathological, I just lie about things, right? Like, if I just told you, like, oh, hey, I have 40 bottles of gin in the kitchen, even though I don't, like, why would I do that? What sense does that make? Of course he lies to get people to do what he wants them to do. That's the point of lying generally.
So when God said God does not lie, that was a lie?
It seems like it. If you're going to take everything in the Bible that is a narrative event as a true thing.
On that instance, then we can't believe anything that's in the Bible.
Well, I mean, I would say that you could. I'm not going to look. I'm not.
You can just pick and choose what you believe, obviously, but that's just arbitrary.
Everyone does. You pick and choose what you believe in the Bible. Are you a flat earther?
No.
Do you think that the heavens are a solid, beaten out piece of material that has windows in it to let through rain and snow, and that God stores up these things in storehouses above the waters of the heavens?
No more than I think it's a cloth. We can use metaphorical language,
but that's the thing. Like that. The same historical narrative that you think is literally true about the flood, also in the same plain language says that God opened up the floodgates of heaven that were in the firmament, the rakia, the solid hammered out thing that it earlier talks about, in the same place it talks about it being a 6-day creation. It doesn't use special language when it's talking about these things. And we also know that those things are compatible with how people at that time and in that place believed that the universe worked. The Bible, if you want to take it literally the whole way through in terms of its historical narrative, tells you that the earth is flat, stationary, that the sun and the moon are inside of a solid dome, and that dome has windows on it that let through rain and snow. and
So
sleet.
let me, if I were to explain my day to you, the sun rose up. I went downstairs. I ate breakfast. I came to work. I went home after work, ate supper. The sun went down, and I went to sleep. There are statements in that you would call lies by that very same standard. Does the sun
I
go up or down?
I am willing to accept that there are phenomenological bits of the Bible. But when the Bible says the floodgates of heaven opened, that is not a phenomenological statement. There is no
What
phenomenon
about the
in
sun?
rain.
How is that not a? How isn't it?
How is it the floodgates of heaven? Because there
How
is
is it?
no
Yeah, how
there
is it
is no
not?
visibly obvious floodgate of heaven. The reason that we can say that the sun rising is a phenomenological statement is because when you look at what's happening with the sun, you seem to be stationary and it seems to go up. It seems to be the thing that's moving. That's why it's phenomenological.
What
But there's
happens?
no
What happens when a
let me finish
floodgate
the
is open?
sentence. Let
Okay,
me
go
finish
ahead.
the sentence. But when you look at the rain, there's no obvious door or gate anywhere in the sky that's being opened. All you see is a bunch of clouds. If you want to say that there's a phenomenological explanation, you could say something like, and then the clouds cried on the earth and there was a great flood. Great, that could be a phenomenological thing, right? Because that is kind of what it looks like. There's
But I
nothing
don't
that
see any
even
eyes in
remotely looks
heaven.
like. You don't see any what?
I don't see any eyes. You need eye. If the heavens are going to cry, they need eyes, don't they? Tears come from
Maybe, or you
eyes.
could say that maybe they sweat. I don't know, but there are ways that you could describe. There are ways that cultures have described rain phenomenologically that is not
And you're
literally
saying
true.
that the floodgates of heaven open can't be that way.
I don't see how that is an evident phenomenological thing that happened, right? When you look at the rain, there's nothing obvious about that that implies there has to be gates, unless your already present assumption, which we know was the present assumption at the time and place that these texts are being written, as well as before and after that, that there is in fact a solid dome, and that the gods, in the case of various cultures, or God, if we're going with the Hebrew conception of God being the supreme God of the universe, that there are in fact these gates in the solid dome, because that was the ubiquitous opinion of the time. And if you want to take it literally in the same way that you take literally the 6 days, great. But if you don't, you are picking and choosing. And why are you doing that? It's because you know the earth isn't flat. You know there isn't a dome. You know there aren't waters above the heaven that are being let through to create rain. You know those things. And you are willing to let your knowledge of the natural world rule over your interpretation of the Bible, and sometimes. That's also why I'm presuming you don't think that having goats and sheep mate in front of stripy sticks makes them have stripy babies, even though that's what's depicted in Genesis. There are all sorts of places in the Bible where you have decided on the basis of your previous knowledge about how the universe actually works, based on the evidence that you have available, that the Bible is not literally true in these cases.
Yeah,
What I
we
am
all
saying is, it is
and
perfectly fine to do that with other parts that you don't. You don't
Okay.
have to take the 6 days any more literally than you have to take the floodgates. You don't have to take the age of the patriarchs or the duration and extent of the flood any more literally than you take the idea that there is a solid dome, which is what rakia means. It's literally a word related to the beating out of metal to make sheet metal, the kind of metal that later on in the Torah, God commands that the Hebrews put around various posts in the tabernacle to create wooden posts and whatnot. It's the same kind of action. I'll shut
when
up now. Sorry.
what happens when people that experience these events are treated as historical figures, though? So
I
yeah,
don't
we
think I
can
understand.
for the sake of argument look at the first 9 chapters of Genesis or whatever and say, yeah, I
Wrap it
don't
up,
know.
guys.
Oh, wait, are we running up against a break? All
We're
right.
over 2 hours.
Okay.
So
It's
I
not the
guess I'll
break. It's been,
say. Oh, sorry. I guess I'll just say.
yeah. Say both your
I
final parts, and then
I
I have
really
one question for
appreciated it.
Alex.
I think that it was. I'll be honest. This went way further into Bible stuff than I was expecting, and I'm perfectly fine with that because, like I said, I think the Bible is really cool. I think it's a fascinating set of texts. I like looking at the different interpretational and exegetical frameworks that people bring to it, why they do and might not work. I think that's all fascinating. I know that myself and Alex are probably not going to agree on a lot of this anytime soon, but I think it was a really fun discussion. And so I'll just shut up there and let Alex and Jackson go.
Well, I just want to say your last thing, Alex, and I'll have one question for you from the audience.
Oh, my last thing. Where do we even go with that? Well, I appreciate you guys having me on. This was a good conversation. I'm sorry if I did seem heated. I didn't mean to. We're all just enjoying the conversation.
I don't think it actually seemed I think it seemed excited, not heated. That's what I'm going to go with.
Yeah,
There
Yeah,
was much.
People
There
can
was
read
much
things in
light,
various
not heat.
ways.
But I mean, look,
Um,
no one insulted each other, right? I didn't say that. Oh, Alex is just a jerk idiot guy. Like, we
That's
were still
true.
cordial.
We did
There
have a
was
guy
just-
on a few weeks ago or a couple months ago, whatever it was, who just resulted in name calling. So that was fun.
Jackson,
I do have.
I said, am I being too mean? And then you said, no, be meaner.
I didn't think you were gonna tell everyone. He was getting on my nerves too, but I didn't. Anyway, the question from the audience.
Said them, like, am I being too mean?
Question
and Jackson,
from the
no.
audience. This is my show. From RJ Downard. Alex, what creationist writers or sources do you typically admire or rely on? From RJ Downard.
Do I typically admire or rely on? Well, like I said at the beginning, creation science really isn't my big shtick. I'm one author that I have relied on and benefited greatly from is Greg Bahnsen. He's a philosopher. So, philosopher, Christian apologist, died almost 30 years ago. So
yeah, I'm not familiar with that name.
Yeah, he's been gone for a long time. One of his proteges would be Jason Lyle. You may have
Oh
heard
no.
of him. So
yeah, we're familiar with him.
Okay, yeah, and you said something about not appreciating the presuppositional method, and it's like, oh, that's interesting. Consider, and that is kind of my overall point. I approached this wanting to provide an internal critique and point out the fact that evolution can't answer certain things, or the naturalistic worldview, or whatever else that it might be, can't answer certain things like the uniformity of nature that I, as a Christian, can. You assume those things, and rightly so, because nature is uniform, but that is evidence of the fact that you are created in the image of God.
Here's a quick fun thing about Jason Lyle.
Sure.
Jason Lyle has said, oh, wait, no, I'm thinking of Nathaniel Jensen, so never mind. That quick fun thing is about a completely different person who, for some reason, I mixed up with Jason Lyle.
That
disregard.
was very fun. I feel more fun as a result of that. Okay, anyway. It's been over 2 hours. So thank you again for coming on, Alex. Thank you, Dapper, for being here. Thank you, Peter, for hosting. And thanks, everybody in the live chat, for watching. And we will see everybody next Thursday. So have a good week, everybody.